Greetings, everybody. I guess good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We're really glad that you have joined us in this global campaign and panel to discuss the challenges and resilience in attaining legal gender recognition across our respective continents. I'm really excited to have friends and comrades on this panel that are just incredible people to be in conversation with for the next hour. I am Jabu Pereira. I am the founding director at Iranti, a lesbian, trans, and intersex rights organization based in Johannesburg. I'm a trans man and my pronouns are he and his. And I'd like to ask the rest of my panel to please introduce themselves, and I'll ask Liberty.
I knew you were going to pick on me, Jabu. Greetings, everyone. My name is Liberty Matthyse, and I am the Executive Director of Gender Dynamics, a South Africa-based trans-led and trans-specific human rights organization with a regional footprint. Thank you. I'll give over to Nhuun.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. My name is Nhuun. I am the Senior Human Rights and Advocacy Officer at the Asia Pacific Transgender Network. We are trans-led regional organization that engage with a wide range of partners across Asia and the Pacific to support, organize, and advocate for fundamental human rights, including gender identity, access to justice, legal protections, and comprehensive gender affirming healthcare and policy for trans and gender diverse people. Yeah, and I would hand the floor to Franco.
Hola a todos, todas y todes. Mi nombre es Franco Fuica, yo soy el coordinador de legislación y políticas públicas de OTD Chile, organizando transdiversidades, y somos una organización que funciona en Chile, pero al mismo tiempo me toca ser también el representante de ILGALAC, el representante trans del ILGALAC en este momento también. Gracias por la invitación.
Wonderful. Just to kick off our conversation, I think we've all been working in different ways on legal gender recognition, and maybe each of you could just sketch what do you see as the critical challenges facing your continent in relation to LGR right now. Franco, how about we start with you?
Gracias, Jabu. Bueno, América Latina y el Caribe es una región muy amplia y muy diversa, con diversos tipos de avance en estas materias. Quizás partir diciendo que en el cono sur, donde está Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, probablemente son los lugares donde el reconocimiento de género ha avanzado más, incluso quizás en todo el mundo. Uruguay podríamos hablar del estándar hoy en día de leyes de identidad de género que no solamente reconocen la identidad, sino también que reconocen la discriminación y exclusión que hemos vivido, lo cual también hace que esta ley tenga reconocimiento y reparación en temas de educación, en salud, en trabajo. Argentina también es una ley que ya tiene bastantes años, probablemente una de las primeras leyes de identidad de género en el mundo, que no es patologizante y que hace poco también incorporó el componente de cupo laboral trans. Chile también es una ley quizás no tan buena como las anteriores, pero también una ley bastante moderna en este sentido, de que incorpora también a identidades trans menores de edad. También, y hay que decirlo también en Argentina, que incorpora desde hace un tiempo atrás a las personas no binarias. Y eso creo que es un tremendo avance también. Pero esto sucede acá en el cono sur, al final del mundo, o al principio del mundo. Pero más adelante, en Centroamérica, la situación es totalmente diferente. una situación donde los niveles de asesinato de personas trans son altísimos y la falta de reconocimiento se nota en todo, en la falta de acceso al trabajo, a la salud, a la educación, a la precarización laboral, en todos los sentidos. Son países que son presa hoy en día de fundamentalistas religiosos, eh, que no logran avanzar y probablemente los próximos 10 años no van a lograr avanzar en un reconocimiento del género de las personas trans. Después yendo un poco más al norte, en México, como es un país federal también que tiene distintos estados, hay muchos estados que son bastante progresistas y otros también que están quedándose un poco atrás, pero yo diría que en general México es un país que ha avanzado muchísimo, al igual que Brasil, que de repente Brasil se nos queda un poco fuera del mapa, justamente porque tenemos una barrera idiomática que ellos hablan portugués, pero también es un país que ha avanzado mucho, un país muy gigante, muy grande, que hay sectores donde se ha avanzado mucho, pero al mismo tiempo, con ese mismo avance también ha significado que también es uno de los países donde también hay mucha violencia contra las personas trans.
Thanks so much. Nhuun, can we go to you?
Okay. Yes, Jabu. So I would respond to your question using our word. Back years ago, we had the research project on the legal gender recognition in Asia, where we actually looking through the laws and policy of the 10 countries in Asia, actually, in relation to the legal gender recognition, and see what is this about, how is recognized trans people, and there is any policy or laws that allow trans people to change the gender marker, for example, right? So we have that report, and and in our website as well for you for more information. But the key finding from that research project is that there is still the lack of legal gender recognition laws and policy in our regions, and there are what is called many of the country doesn't allow transgender to change the gender marker based on their what is called self-identifications, right? And it prevents trans people from accessing education, employment, migrations, social welfare, protections, and also other basic needs. And in our regions, only few countries such as Nepal, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, they have some sort of laws that protecting trans people as well. And there are some of the provisions that allows trans people to be recognized as a third gender, but not much about, permit the trans man to choose as to be recognized as male, or permit trans women to be recognized as female. And it's not also comprehensively recognize all the spectrums of trans also. Some of the country only recognize some cultural identities, namely Hijra, right? But transgender as a whole is not that recognized in the law yet. And some of the country as well, the law is not fully implemented on the ground. So there are the calls from the civil society there to really fully implement what written in the laws, and what is called unpack what is this about in the law, because there are no implementation so far, and it's hard to access the legal gender recognition there still. And in some other countries in Asia as well, there are some sort of recognition of transgender, but in very pathological way as well, right? It's hard to pronounce, and I'm Asians. Pathological way as well. They are really, you need some sort of the certification to be recognized as the trans woman or woman in the military. In the military spaces, for example, in Thailand, right? They are still like, if you want to be exempt from the military conscriptions, not similar to the other people who born male, right? You need the certification to prove that you have some sort of the, what is called, medical conditions. they name it medical condition something. And there are still existing a lot of existing discriminatory binary laws and practice, because we have really many countries in Asia still follows those colonial past, right? That bring those binary system to our regions, and the law is still discriminatory and binary based on that. And for example, we still have the criminalized of the and those criminalization laws, for example, anti-sodomy law or anti-sex worker law that have still happening in these regions and is used to persecute or used to violate trans people, right? And trans people really have got really disproportionate impact from that law. And then also the conversive and cultural and religious value also play the important roles that prevent trans people have a lot of influence in the law actually, and prevent trans people to access the legal gender recognition as well. I will stop here.
Yes. Perfect. That's really great. Liberty?
Thanks, Jabu. So I think for me, from where I am based, very much stigma, discrimination, and violence continue to be a defining characteristics of the lives of us as trans and gender diverse persons, not just in South Africa, but also across the sub-region, Southern Africa. Africa is a vast continent with many, many countries. And I think if I was to talk to all of those country contexts, I would really be doing an injustice. I'll limit my perspective also to a very much a Southern Africa vantage point. In addition to that, I think that class issues as well as geographical location issues continue to be a defining characteristic of access based on where you are located, and of course, whether you can afford to be able to travel from one place, particularly from rural context, peri-urban context to urban centers in the country, in order to get access to gender-affirming healthcare and, of course, subsequently, then legal gender recognition. But more so, I think how we view it is that there are three key issues that we are dealing with. The first one is the issue around whether legislation actually exists that provides a legal mechanism to which a trans or gender diverse person can amend the gender particulars with a Department of Home Affairs. And in many regards, most instances across the Southern Africa region, no express law exists that allows for one to amend one's gender marker, except for in South Africa, where we've got the Alteration of Sex Description and Sex Status Act 49 of 2003. And so in many instances where there's no express piece of legislation, human rights activists and community members are relying on national identification acts to be able to have a more expansive interpretation, making it possible for one to change one's gender marker. So what I mean by expansive interpretation is really looking at the criteria that one's identification document needs to be an accurate reflection of your true identity within society. So in those instances, cases can be made that the state actually would allow for the amendment of gender particulars. In addition to that, the second component really revolves around the conceptual framing and the design of pieces of legislation, like the Alteration of Sex Description and Sex Status Act, where we know it's inherently flawed because firstly, it is based on a biomedical model of recognition. So you need to get access to gender affirming healthcare, have proof that you got an access to gender affirming healthcare before you can actually go to Department of Home Affairs to be able to initiate an application. And that's problematic because gender affirming healthcare remains inaccessible for the vast majority of our people because it is initiated at tertiary healthcare level within urban centers. Secondly, when we are looking at the binary construction, it also doesn't speak to non-binary identities. And so in that sense, the legislation is inherently limited. In other instances, like Namibia, we find that there's an emphasis being placed under the Births and Deaths Registration Act, basically requiring a person to have undergone surgical affirmation before they can even initiate the application process. So a very high threshold of proof that you need to execute before you can even stand a chance of getting your gender marker amended. In addition to that, again, from a conceptual and design framework, it doesn't include other marginalized demographics within our community. That includes children under the age of 18, of course, prisoners and refugees and asylum seekers who also need to have gender marker changes at one point or another. And so at this moment, no express provision allows for that change to be made to identification documents. And then, of course, I think in relation to implementation, if the legislation is there or the provision is there, the implementation of that remains an issue. In South Africa, the legal mechanism is unaccompanied by a standard operating procedure, which allows Home Affairs officials to be very selective in how they implement a piece of legislation. And of course, stigma and discrimination leading to people not being able to initiate the application. Secondly, there's a lot of gatekeeping that takes place because of no consistent and clear guidelines being provided on how the law must be implemented. And then the long processing time that makes it even more inaccessible because people need to travel back and forth between their homes and Home Affairs departments, that's turning them away. So I think for me, that is where we are currently sitting as a region. And of course, particularly also from a South African vantage point where an express law currently exists. And there's a lot of work that we are currently doing in terms of advancing for change in this particular context around legal gender recognition. I'll park there, Jabu.
Thank you, everybody. I mean, it's vast continents that we're covering within our panel. So thanks for being so succinct on that. I guess, you know, if we look at this past week, we have some interesting developments in one is Chile, where same-sex marriage is being permitted. On the other hand, in Germany, trans people are demanding compensation around forced sterilization that has taken place, and how trans bodies historically have been tortured, particularly through medicalized processes and so on. But in both of these, oh, and then we've got Barbados that suddenly, you know, is now, the Queen has given up her reign in Barbados and is become independent, and well done to Barbadians for fighting for their own independence. So Nhuun, you also touched on that about, you know, we speak about colonialism like it's historic, but it's actually not. It's like so present in our legislation, in our lives, in our daily existence. You know, the fact that many Africans have to possess English names is a whole, you know, if you think about all these kinds of different permeations and imprints of colonialism on our existing bodies, we don't have to look beyond where we currently are within the spectrum of our bodies. So when we look at these different scenarios just in 1 week, independence, reparations for trans people, you know, it all comes back to the fact that states have immense power over our bodies and our autonomy. And if we look at the debates within Ghana right now, the anti-gay sentiments, the issues around criminalization, they all intersect with legal gender recognition, or just legal recognition. If we can take out the gender part, the legal recognition part. My question really is, I don't know if it's a question, but I'd love your perspective on this, because I think for all centuries of existence, trans people have fought just for social recognition and social existence. And in fact, trans bodies have been on the forefront of queer liberation throughout the US. Anywhere, you know, you speak about Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson. I mean, in every continent, there's a hero and there's a trans hero. So or Shiro, there are trans people that have been immensely resilient, that have died for queer struggles and queer liberation. But it almost feels like LGR struggles is a trans struggle. And it's not a collective struggle, you know, whereas trans people are fighting for decriminalization, anti-colonization. So I'm wondering what you think about this issue, about the resilience of fighting for social legal gender recognition and legal gender recognition as a root in itself. Given that trans people have always been the subversive bodies of liberation. Who would want to kick off with their own thoughts on what I'm raising and thoughts around that? I think Liberty.
I thought the question was directed at Nhuun, but okay, Jabu. It's interesting, right? And you mentioned many components. Perhaps just to start off with around the issue of same-sex marriage and also what that has meant in the South African context, how problematic it is to not recognize trans and gender diverse persons in the course of marriage. Whereby if we're looking at KOS versus Subramani, whereby transgender persons were discriminated against, and of course the couple themselves, because the union that was solemnized under the Traditional Marriage Act, which is of course the marriage act that exclusively applies to heterosexual couples, because they're married under that piece of legislation as a de facto, for all legal intents and purposes, heterosexual couple, and one of the spouses wants to undergoes gender affirming healthcare and then wants to change the gender marker, the Department of Home Affairs said no, because we've got one register for opposite sex couples and we've got another register for same sex couples under the Civil Union Act. And so that really highlighted the vacuum in our law and how trans and gender diverse persons were not taken into account when we were negotiating for inclusion at that particular point. I mean, here we sat with a situation where one marriage was nullified by the Department of Home Affairs, so it was deleted from the system in order for the gender marker change to be made. Secondly, a gender marker change being refused on the basis that it was the delays was just too long, and that constituted a refusal because the persons were married under the Traditional Marriage Act. And so after KOS, our constitution, the Constitutional Court held that, the High Court of the Western Cape held that it is unconstitutional and unlawful to discriminate against somebody on the basis of the gender identity in context of marriage law and deny them access to a legal gender marker change. So I think when we are looking at same-sex marriage rights, it's very important to understand what it is that we are intending to create, but also be mindful of the unintentional consequences that might flow for marginalized communities. To your point around reparations, I think it's very much important conversation that we also need to have, that we haven't really had as trans and gender diverse persons in our respective contexts, because we are so focused on just getting recognition before we can even get to the question around what does reparations mean, right? Recognize us first, and then of course to that we want you to recognize the harm that you have caused in the process, the social stigma, the discrimination, the violence that we've had to endure. And I think that's an ongoing conversation. And so when we are looking at what is currently unfolding in the global context in countries like Germany, it sets a very important tone for what we can achieve within our respective context in holding our governments and our leaders accountable for perpetuating harm against our communities.
Okay. Who would want to go next? Franco?
Ok. Quizás voy a centrarme en lo que preguntabas principalmente del matrimonio en Chile, quizás sea bueno como aclararlo. Bueno, ayer o anteayer ya, como muchos sabrán ya, en Chile se aprobó el matrimonio igualitario, pero que tiene una cláusula particular respecto de personas trans. Y esto se remonta un poco más atrás, ¿cierto?, a la ley de identidad de género que sacamos el año 2018, donde se indica que todas las personas mayores de 18 años pueden hacer su tránsito o su cambio de nombre y género en el registro civil, que es un órgano administrativo del Estado. Menos las personas que estaban casadas. Las personas que estaban casadas debían hacerlo en un tribunal de familia, donde el primer paso del juez iba a ser cambiar el nombre y el segundo paso era anular el matrimonio que estas personas tenían. Anularlo y dejarlo con los efectos de un divorcio. Esto queriéndolo o no queriéndolo. Se hacía y punto. Es decir, era un derecho por otro. Usted quiere tener identidad de género, pero pierde su derecho a la familia. Ahora, esto de alguna forma se reparó en la ley de matrimonio igualitario, donde se logró que las personas transcasadas pudieran hacerlo igual en el registro civil, también de manera administrativa, y el registro civil lo que hará será informarle al cónyuge, ¿cierto?, que la persona trans que se hizo el cambio de nombre, se hizo este cambio, y que esta persona, en este caso su cónyuge cis, por decirlo de alguna forma, tiene 6 meses para solicitar un divorcio inmediato con esta persona trans. Lo que nos parece, todavía estamos pensando cuál es la razón por esto. Según los diputados, es porque se supone que la persona trans engañó, ¿cierto?, a esta persona cis, y en base a ese engaño es que esto se hace tan rápido, teniendo en consideración que un divorcio en Chile para personas cis se demora 1 año y medio si están los dos de acuerdo, y 3 años si es que hay solamente uno que esté de acuerdo. Pero el caso de las personas trans, independientemente que esté o no de acuerdo esa persona trans de divorciarse, se va a hacer este divorcio express rápidamente en 6 meses, porque la ley lo permite ahora. La ley permite divorciarse de la persona trans como si a la persona cis se lo hubiese estado engañando. Si bien es un avance que ya no se haga una sede en tribunales, sí es un espacio, ¿cierto?, a la discriminación de personas trans que van a poder, que no tienen su matrimonio no tiene la misma validez que de otros matrimonios. Tienen 6 meses en los cuales la persona trans no sabe si su pareja va a divorciarse o no, y puede hacerlo de manera unilateral. Y eso nos parece grave. Quedo hasta ahí por el tiempo.
Okay, it's me now. Yeah, I think for me is the questions about, I would try to respond about what is very more important between the social recognitions and also the legal gender recognitions, right? That this question for me is very it's very hard to respond, and it's very theoretical in a way as well, I think. But again, what I would like to say here, right? I think it's kind of like equally important in a way, because it's for legal gender recognition, because we cannot deny, right, the access to infrastructure, the access to the basic needs, this type of things is leans toward the control of the state in the form of laws, right? So that's we need to also, in the short run, for me, it's like we also need somehow of the recognition in the law, so that we can access to those basic needs and also social services, and in control of the governments, right? In control of the state nations, actually. But like I said, I use the word state control because I think that we need to be also mindful about it's like we turning ourselves in the state control as well, right? In a way, because we turn our body to be regulated by the state, actually, right? And I think so that so the recognition of ourselves is not actually it's really lean on what the state see us, right? Yeah, it's very lean on what the state see us, so the state think about us, right? And it's really leans toward those type of the idea of the what is called the capitalism, the idea of the what is called neoliberalism as well, this type of thing. And it's kind of like they describe our life, ourselves, in the way that that not really about us actually. It's about the, you know, if the state really capitalist, for example, right? They might describe us as the, you know, cis people who need nuclear family, white, this type of thing, right? And but we are beyond that. We are beyond that. We are trans. We are, you know, we are trans who have other intersectional oppression, struggle, this type of thing, right? We are not just only what the state pretend in the law. So that I think the way of thinking that we don't, we should not just strict to the advocate for the legal recognitions, but the social recognition should become in place in the way that we should also have, we should also reimagine our life, or what is what we really need, you know, what we really need in terms of like the person in the society, those type of the thing, right? What do we imagine? So it's beyond the state looking at us and provide the rights, this type of thing. It's beyond the state control, this type of thing, right? So yeah, we should also think about those we really we also need to think about our intersectional identity that we have as well. For example, we might also belong in some of the religious community, indigenous communities, those type of thing, right? But now the legal recognition is framed in the way that benefit only trans people who live in the global north country, who are middle class, this type of thing. So it's for us to reimagine our life more also, and it's important also to advocate for the social recognition in the exact way we are. So yeah, I'm not quite sure I'm making sense, but yeah, I mean, there are some of the critical approach we can look at the legal recognition as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I got a bit of chills about when you were saying that, you know, we are giving our bodies up to state control, even in this battle around legal gender recognition. And I think it's something we have to, in many ways, be cognizant of. It's on the one hand, like legal gender recognition is about the access we want to a livelihood and living and surviving and being recognized. But on the other hand, it pushes us in many countries into a binary framework and identity, also where non-binary people are not recognized. So it's a complex struggle overall. And just in our chat, Abby, you know, I agree, is saying that there are even controls in where indigenous communities, their own identities and gender expressions have been eroded in many respects, you know, through colonial practices and so forth. And I think when we look at the power that we immerse ourselves in as trans people around social recognition, public survival, safety, dignity, love, to be loved, to exist, all of these kinds of issues. I guess my question then is really about, you know, in some ways, what does trans survival look like now in our work? Because our work, we are all here as activists from structured movements. So on the one hand, our work is very driven through a very common advocacy agenda and what that looks like. But does that really match and correlate with trans survival? And how do you see trans survival and trans existence in this current time? Anybody wants to go? What does it mean to be resilient in this time, you know? Franco.
Um, es una pregunta muy compleja, pero creo que es importante decir que lo primero, que la gente no tendría por qué ser resiliente, no tendríamos por qué siempre estar luchando contra el sistema para sobrevivir, pero es como lo único que nos ha tocado hacer para justamente eso, para seguir viviendo. Um, yo creo que hay diversos contextos. El contexto de América, hay contextos más favorecidos, mucho más privilegiados, donde hemos ido logrando crear alianzas y que esa supervivencia sea menos dolorosa. Pero hay lugares donde la sentencia es a muerte desde muy temprana edad, desde que las personas trans en la adolescencia empezamos a florecer más, a que se nos note más, o incluso antes a veces. Son contextos muy dolorosos donde la expectativa de vida es muy corta, muy limitada. Hay gente que no va más allá de los 20, 25 años en las zonas de Centroamérica. En América Latina en general se habla de una cifra de 35 años de expectativa de vida. Entonces, como digo, creo que es muy duro ser siempre resiliente, pero creo que es la única forma hoy en día que tenemos de sobrevivir y de legar memoria a quienes vienen detrás de nosotros. Y creo que la responsabilidad que tenemos hoy es justamente de resistir y de ir creando, en la medida de lo posible, normativas que permitan a otros que vienen detrás de nosotros vivir mejor. Porque creo que quizás muchos de nosotros ni siquiera vamos a ver los cambios que hayamos instalado. Puede ser que nos vayamos antes, pero la gente que viene detrás de nosotros creo que es una tremenda responsabilidad de que ojalá tengan una vida menos difícil que la nuestra.
Yeah, Liberty, any thoughts from your side?
Indeed, Jabu. I think that I agree with a lot of the sentiments shared by Franco, and I think it's very much applicable even in our context. The question about why is it necessary for us to have to be resilient, where we, as human beings that identify with gender in a different way than what the norm might identify, also has a right to be able to live our freedom, our dignity, and our equality. And so I think a big question mark that we need to ask society at large, why should certain communities have to be resilient in order to survive? But I think trans and gender diverse survival to me means because of the complex and diverse location, geopolitical, legal context that we are living in and socioeconomic conditions that we are living through, that it sometimes means having to hide yourself in order to survive. And I think that has elicited a lot of questions in our own community and in society at large. Why do some trans and gender diverse persons come out later on in life? And it's because of the hostile context that we are living in and living through. And we need to be very strategic in terms of how we shape our survival mechanisms to live to the next moment. I think in addition to that, many of us just put on that resilience mantle, knowing what society is going to be throwing at us, and to some extent understanding that that is a reality of life here and now. But the work that we are doing hopefully contributes to a future that is going to be much more enabling for trans and gender diverse persons that will be following in our footsteps. And of course, it means negotiating for belonging. I mean, how many times do we find ourselves in positions and diversely so where we are using money as a bargaining chip for our own belonging in families? So that if you are employed in a poor working class community and you have a job and you have an income, then your protection is dependent on the money that you are bringing in. And so there's a lot of work that we need to do around unconditioning people to think that that is a trade-off at our community level and within our family context. But I think that is definitely one way in which we are trying to survive at this time. It speaks to the unjust economic systems and labor markets that we are participating in and that we find ourselves in or isolated from, and how that also needs to be transformed to make space for us to be able to live lives with dignity in that sense. And then in other instances, I think it speaks to when the context becomes so hostile that you are fearing for your life and for imminent harm occurring to you, then we flee. We flee that context and we seek refuge in another space we believe to be conducive to our overall health and well-being. And this is what we are seeing in South Africa, when many of our siblings are coming to the country with the hope of pursuing a life that allows them a level of equality and freedom and dignity. But here too, because of social stigma, discrimination, and violence, the harsh reality is that it is not a conducive context. And so I think that is how I see trans survival and gender diverse survival within our context.
Thanks, Nhuun.
Yeah, I think I really agree with both Franco and Liberty in the way that, yeah, it's really the resilience is really it's very hard to be resilient in the really severe and hostile context, right? And I think it's also like in, for example, in Asia, right? Trans people is like yeah, without legal recognitions, with the criminalizations, with the pathological practice, this type of thing, conversion therapy or something, others, you name it, right? Trans people are really put in very vulnerable positions and to the discrimination and violence type of thing. And even the state that should, who's supposed to protect and, you know, the rights of these trans people, they are also the perpetrator themselves in the way that they use this law to criminalize and use this law to, what is called, to prevent the existing of the trans people. When trans people speak up, they kind of like persecute them. And I really think, and also, yeah, and many of us need to refugee to other country, becomes refugee and struggle with a struggle in different country, right? And also, given our context that we have those our economics is very like unjust actually, and is there are the wide gap or the rich between the rich and the poor, right? And then trans people tends to be under the poverty line because of the discriminations against them in the work, in the access to employment, this type of thing, and they cannot have the proper income to be survive, right? Why a lot of basic needs in these regions privatized actually is for sale. So this they have the small of the money already, and they need to spend a lot with the basic needs. So it's really pushed them to the another form of violation, which is the poverty, right? Extreme poverty in these regions. And you know, the poor is they live in very poor quality of life and living conditions, and some of us need to migrate to other country in order to survive, because in their country the economics is very collapsed already, and and due to the corruption, the money go to the rich people and people in power in the country, right? So I think it's very like here is very, the situation is very severe. And when I work on the ground, right, when I work with the people that I really committed to, when I listen to their story, their story, their struggle, and how they try to survive day by day, I think this is resilience for me, actually. Every story that I heard, people struggle, this type of thing, and everyone, I really fascinate in the, I'm not gonna say fascinate. I'm very like appreciate in a way that how they can manage to be where they are actually. So yeah, I think being resilient is very simple here. We just to survive day by day is something to say, and they are still living. It's things to celebrate here already.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, often the stereotype is that we need legal gender recognition because we are cis aspiring, right? So the one part is really how do we kind of overcome these notions of the backlash around the gender backlash. In many regards, that we are transitioning because we are confusing family structures, we are dismantling family notions, etc. So on the one hand, we have that. And then, as you're saying, Nhuun, on the other hand, we just have an entire trans community of people who are just trying to get by and survive and live and be alive, and so forth. And here we are in our activist roles, which sometimes makes me just feel, on the one hand, so privileged about the work I do, the power that one holds to be able to command this kind of work and direction, but it is exhausting. And I think maybe for, how do we as a collective, what could we improve on in terms of our solidarity in this work? What do we need to stay in this measure of struggle to attain self-determination and bodily autonomy and freedom and dignity? And I'm wondering, outside of our advocacy language of legal gender recognition, what do we need? What do you think we need as people who do this work to stay doing this work?
Yeah. So Jabu, perhaps I can go and try not to use legal gender recognition language. I think that very much focus on healing and self-care is so critical. Many a time we find ourselves burnt out because we are fighting the battle on the outside, in the external world. But then, of course, we are also sometimes very much not fighting each other per se, but also having tensions with one another within a collective space. And so part of the healing and self-care work is to find ways in which we can communicate with one another in our movements in a way that doesn't elicit trauma and re-traumatize each other within those collective spaces, because then that just becomes another cumulative factor on top of so many others that leads to us not being able to proceed and fight the battle that we are around human rights advancements for us, for trans and gender diverse persons, and other marginalized demographics through an intersectional lens more broadly. And so I think it does start with healing and self-care, and also recognizing that we can find reassurance in our pre-colonial histories, whereby we are validated by those histories. And I think just knowing that even takes a huge burden off our shoulders to have to prove ourselves on a constant basis to the public that we are who we say we are. We know who we are. Our history attests to how we have been validated and embraced and loved by our ancestors in pre-colonial times, where colonization has just upset that entire balance, destroyed that entire balance. And I think I find meaning in that for myself, but also looking at how healing and self-care can contribute to the individual wellness, but also collective wellness in our movements.
Anybody? Franco?
Gracias. Sí, yo creo que nosotros como activistas, como personas trans, estamos súper ligadas constantemente a vivir y a conocer, como decía Nhuun, también muchos hechos de violencia de otras personas. Para mí creo que una de las formas de cuidarnos es que seamos más, que no seamos las mismas personas que estamos recibiendo todo lo, lo, lo difícil, lo cruento que vivimos o que vive nuestra comunidad. Creo que el ser más va, de alguna forma, va a depositar menos peso en cada uno. Para eso es necesario seguir avanzando en crear más activismo, en tener más recursos, en autocuidarse también. Eh, Quizás como para comentarles algo, nosotros dentro de OTD en Chile hemos estado este último tiempo bastante preocupados justamente del cuidado, dado que como estamos a puertas en una semana más en una elección que no se veía en Chile hace más de 40 años, donde tenemos una derecha muy de ultraderecha y una izquierda progresista, eh, vemos que si es que esta elección gana la derecha, vamos a tener muchas dificultades para vivir y vamos a ser un país tal como Brasil o como Estados Unidos. Estamos muy preocupados por eso, porque además, justamente, las autoridades de esos partidos políticos de ultraderecha ya han comenzado a perseguirnos, a la gente de OTD, a perseguirnos solicitando información de quiénes somos, información de qué personas trans están haciendo tránsitos de género en los hospitales, quieren saber ese tipo de cosas, quieren tener listas de personas trans. Y nos tiene muy preocupado eso. Creemos que la forma de avanzar hoy es siendo um, confiables, amorosos, cariñosos, muy empáticos entre nosotros, cuidarnos a través de esas cuestiones que de alguna forma el sistema ha ido desechando. Hoy en día el sistema no habla del afecto, del cariño, habla como del rendir cuentas, que también está muy bien y hay que hacerlo. Pero creo que hay un factor tan importante en el cuidado que es eso, que es ese cuidado de querernos, de vernos como si viéramos a otras personas como a nosotras mismas. Esa empatía que nos hace mucha falta. Creo que es una de las cuestiones que tenemos que hacer y que tenemos que invitar a otros que tienen más poder que nosotros, a vernos también con esa empatía. No solamente a nosotros en Chile, sino a todos. Porque creo que todas las personas trans y todos los activistas en el mundo siempre estamos en peligro y necesitamos siempre tener aliados fuertes, pero al mismo tiempo cariñosos que nos tiendan una mano y que nos ayuden a seguir adelante.
Absolutely. Solidarity to you as you go into this next period, Franco, and all the best to everybody in Chile. Yeah. Nhuun, any closing thoughts as well from your side? Yes, thank
you. So yeah, when we talk about solidarities, right, and when we talk about what we can do as trans women collectively worldwide, right? I think we need to be more radical about radical about our political positions, right? When we look at the agenda that maybe when we look at the laws and the policy, the type of thing, look at the how laws, how human rights language describes trans people, right? It's really limited actually, and it's really it's very set some norms that not that relevant to us, right? So I think we need to come back to ourselves, actually, who we are, right? We need to come back to ourselves, who we are. We need to be radical about it, and we need to escape from what the state control describe us, what is the neoliberal what is called structure describe us, what is the colonialism describe us as well. We need to come back to visit who we are with the more intersectional lens as well, in the way that we look at our community. Our community is not just trans men or trans women, but there are non-binary people. There are people in the some of the indigenous group with some sort of ethnicity, live in the context, different context of religions, this type of thing, right? And some of us is in global north, some of us in the global south, and this region is not equal, right? We know that in the way that the economic frameworks work this day, right? It's very like, it's very helps transfer the resource from the global south to the global north, for example, right? So I mean, we need to be more, we need to look at our life, revisit our reimagine. Actually, I'm going to use reimagine because I advocate because it's beyond that. We are currently describe our lives by using based on the what people say about us, but we never come back to actually revisit about who we are actually and what we want. We should have the radical strong demands to put for out there also, right? And I also think about, yeah, and it's really, and legal gender recognition is and it can be framed in the other way than the gender marker as well. It means that the laws, the wide range of law and policy, healthcare, macroeconomics policies have thing that we also can also advocate for. It's not just about gender marker, right? If we really know what we want, no, and we can change the structure based on our demands. And yeah, and actually I would say that closing, yeah, I really, I always say to the people that close to me working together that trans life is beyond human rights. Human right is really center with the thought of the people, white male in the UN, for example, right? And they and it's really limited, and they force us to go by their games. But we need to have our games. Actually, we need to have our strong demands. Come back to it, like that. Mm.
Well, thank you to all of you. For sharing this hour together. I feel immensely nourished and comforted by the way in which we are all holding space across the world in different respects. And yes, and I think your words is the way we should all part tonight, is to always return to the self. And in returning this into the self, we are able to return and be available to many in a more communal and mutual way. I think the work is immensely long, the struggle is long, and remember, we must pace ourselves to get to the other side. So solidarity to everybody that has joined this panel, and let the struggle continue. And thank you for being with us this evening or in your morning. Goodbye from us. Thank you. And thank you to my panel. You incredible people. Thank you.